Welcome to our digital discussion tonight. My name is John Harry, the Programs and Marketing Fellow at the Milwaukee County Historical Society. So happy that you are with us for the Milwaukee River Basin Legacy and Restoration with Cheryl Nenn from the Milwaukee Riverkeeper. Before I turn things over to Cheryl, just kind of want to let you know what's going on in the world of the Historical Society a little bit. Actually, at this minute, so after the talk tonight, you can go out and grab a beer. It's our own beer. How fun is that? It was released today by Indeed Brewing in Walker's Point. So it's the tap room release event going till 10 o'clock tonight. I think it's some music playing too. So after you get done with this, you can go grab a pint of our Lady Elgin beer inspired by the story of the Lady Elgin. If you're not familiar with the story of the Lady Elgin, boy, do you have an opportunity to get familiar with it next week. Our presentation is with Carl Baer. He wrote a book on the Irish in Milwaukee, and of course that story of the Lady Elgin plays heavily into Irish identity in the city of Milwaukee. So next week, can you believe it's March already next week? Holy cow. So 7:30 next Thursday, Facebook Live, YouTube. If you're watching right now, then you know what's going on next week too. And that talk sponsored by Indeed Brewing, where the beer, the Lady Elgin, is on tap right now. Tonight, we are going to kind of continue what we talked about last week, but in a more environmental lean, as we have Cheryl Nenn, who is the Riverkeeper of the Milwaukee Riverkeeper. And she is going, that's got to be the coolest title in the world. Other than like Lighthouse Keeper, I feel like Riverkeeper. You would probably argue Riverkeeper is a way better job than Lighthouse Keeper, but can't wait to hear all about the work that the Milwaukee Riverkeeper is doing and the state of the Milwaukee River Basin. We'll have a Q&A at the end, so put any questions you want in the comments, and we'll try. There I am. But we'll have Cheryl take over right now and enjoy Legacy and Restoration, the Milwaukee River Basin. Cheryl, take it away.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for coming tonight. Hoping to talk to you a little bit about the Milwaukee River and the legacy and changes that have happened over the years. And then we'll talk a little bit about current water quality and what some of our challenges are and opportunities. And then we'll talk a little bit about what's to come as well. So for folks who aren't familiar with us, we're a nonprofit organization. We started in 1995. And our mission is to protect, improve, and advocate for water quality, riparian wildlife habitat, and sound land management in the Milwaukee, Menomonee, and Kinnickinnic Rivers. And so basically we're working for clean water, healthy communities, and our work tends to fall in 4 different buckets, which we call protect, restore, connect, and advocate, but just different ways of getting people connected with the rivers. Some of the things we do water quality monitoring. We have around 85 to 100 volunteers at any given time that are out testing the water monthly. We do paddle events, we do river cleanups, restoration projects, we patrol, we educate, and we advocate. So we review all the permits of folks discharging to the rivers, developing next to the rivers, review local, state, federal policies that are impacting our waters, and try to get folks like you involved in all of that work. So what Riverkeeper means is we're actually part of a group called Waterkeeper Alliance, which now has 340 different waterkeepers in 43 countries that all have a license to be a riverkeeper, a waterkeeper, or a coastkeeper. We're all independent organizations with our own fundraising. We basically are the voice for the river, the scientist, the lawyer. We respond to citizen concerns and complaints, find solutions to environmental problems, and work with a lot of partners on different projects to get our rivers closer to clean, fishable, swimmable, drinkable resources. So I know that you guys had a talk last week that delved a little bit more into the history, but I want to talk a little bit about the rivers and how they changed over time, and then we'll get into what that means for water quality and habitat and different things like that. But you know, clearly there's been many different Native people that have called Milwaukee home. And our rivers themselves are Algonquin, you know, and Menomonee means men is good and men is grain, so it means good grain. Obviously, Menomonee is another word for wild rice. Milwaukee, you know, is basically the good land. And then Kinnickinnic, for people who don't know, or Kinnickinnic, is, from my understanding, a ceremonial mixture of leaves and tobacco and kind of a ceremonial mix of tobacco that's used during ceremonial purposes. So early on, you know, you can see the map on the bottom right. This whole area was wild marshland and was a really amazing resource for fishing and hunting and, you know, and for harvesting foods that could be eaten. And this is, I think, a cool map. This is from 1835 of just kind of the first European settlers, if you will, who, you know, I don't need to go into all of this for folks that go to the Historic Society, but you know, our founders, obviously, Juneau, Byron, Kilbourne, Selma Juneau, Byron, Kilbourne, and George Walker clearly didn't like each other very much, but lived on different, you know, the rivers kind of divided them there and they had their own little areas. But, you know, eventually came together and formed a city, which is the city that we love. But the cool thing about this picture, I think, is it really shows you that original entrance of our rivers to Lake Michigan, which are much further south than they are today. And we'll look at that in a couple other maps coming up. But, you know, we really had these amazing rivers. We had access that went to the west, access that went to the north, access, you know, that went to the southwest. And so the rivers really did provide, you know, amazing ways to get to the natural resources that were in, you know, southeast Wisconsin. And we really did have a superior port for many years until Chicago kind of caught up to us with the railroads. But, you know, we're really here because of the access that the rivers afforded to the interior part of the state. And I found these maps the other day. They're pretty neat. They're from a website, UWM Environmental Justice Lab, but they really do a great job of showing over time the changing of the rivers. So you can really see, and especially the top maps, you know, the top left one is pretty similar to the one I just showed in 1836, where there's still pretty much wild rivers at that point. And then you can see in around 1846, Milwaukee developed something called the straight cut, which I don't know if you can see my cursor, but in that middle picture, it's kind of that little stick that looks like it's coming out into the lake. But that was really the first attempt to make a straight connection into the river systems to make it much easier for ships to get into port. And you can see in the subsequent maps that that straight cut's a little bit more, you know, defined, but there's still the original entrance from the river system, which is kind of at the bottom of what is today the Port of Milwaukee, is still kind of there. And then over time, really just how the rivers have changed into more industrial. And then now into what we have today, where the straight cut really is the only entrance to Lake Michigan. And then this is now the Port of Milwaukee. But clearly, you know, I think you can tell a lot about a city from how we've treated our rivers. And I think Milwaukee is not different than most of the other American cities, or I'd say cities worldwide, that have really modified the rivers over the years to suit their needs, you know, to suit shipping needs. They've been dredged, they've been widened, they've been moved, they've been hardened, filled in, all of the different, you know, things that have happened in order to create our city. And some of them we're trying to deal with still today, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So these are just, again, some more kind of just maps. This is a kind of zoom in of that 1848 map where you saw that straight cut that came in. And then this picture is really looking downstream from the Water Street Bridge. So kind of this section of the river. But very cool, you know, obviously that the main thing that was really going on at that point was shipping. And that really did lead to a lot of the rivers in downtown Milwaukee being dredged significantly, widened and changed, as I mentioned before. This is, I think, a really great picture of the Menomonee Valley. You know, and really, you know, the Milwaukee really pushed into the valley, pushed to the west, kind of in the mid 1800s or so. And that really facilitated a lot of different canal building, which was quite aggressive and interesting, I think, in the Menomonee Valley in particular. And, you know, kind of continued well into the early 1900s. Here's just some more shots. I think the middle map is pretty interesting in that this one, I think, is from 1885, but maybe is a kind of a little bit, just you can see a little bit all of the different canals that they were creating even back then. And these, I think, other pictures are mostly from 1885 or thereabouts of the Burnham Canal and the South Menomonee Canal and the main stem of the Menomonee River. And then this is kind of another map, I think, from 1900 that really shows, you know, this is, I don't know if you can see the bottom right-hand map, that top canal we currently call the South Menomonee Canal, and it's still there. It's adjacent to the Valley Power Plant. And then the Burnham Canal is still present as well. All of these kind of north-south connecting channels are gone. And then clearly there also is a canal to the north, which is very close to the post, well, really the post office on St. Paul is built on top of that canal. So a lot of modifications that happened over the years for, the unbelievable amount of industry that came into the Menomonee Valley. And, it really was this machine shop to the world at one point. We were creating motors and rail cars and farm machinery and, all of the equipment. And then, converting all of the wheat that was being grown in Southeast Wisconsin to flour, and converting, hogs to ham and barley to beer and cattle to meat and leather and all of those different products. But, I think through that conversion, there was very significant modifications filling in the Menomonee Valley in particular, but as well as other parts of the city as well. So these are kind of a mix of kind of some historic pictures. On the top left, you really see the remnants of the Milwaukee Road Shop. I think at one point I'd heard that they were creating 70% of the rail cars in the country, but it was creating thousands of jobs, even back in the early 1900s, and, huge industry in Milwaukee. And I think everybody who's, from local knows that the transformation of the Menomonee Valley has been really spectacular, and some really wonderful work by the city of Milwaukee and Menomonee Valley Partners and others to, come in there now and clean up a lot of this legacy contamination, really convert it into, basically a light industrial park where it's bringing jobs back to the valley, but also, creating some very cool river access. We have several canoe access points, great pedestrian bridges, and some very cool stormwater ponds that essentially treat a lot of the runoff that's coming off of the land before it gets into the Menomonee River. And also, a lot of companies can kind of come in and plug into a lot of the infrastructure that was built by the city. But, this is kind of just east of What's Miller Park today, these pictures here. So obviously just really pretty amazing transformation. And, similarly, other things, the same thing was going on in other parts of the city. I think one of the most famous is, obviously Jones Island, which in this map from 1870, you can see was still in fact a kind of an island. I think it wasn't originally a peninsula, but, in the 1870s or thereabout, we had a lot of the Kashub and German folks that moved into Jones Island and were, fishermen. Ultimately, they were kind of forced out of Jones Island for the sewage treatment plant. I'm not entirely sure when that top right-hand picture was taken, but we know the sewage treatment plant came in around 1925. And so I think this picture could be somewhere around 1900s or a little bit later than that, probably, because you actually see the real Port of Milwaukee here. But, just obviously some really huge transformations. The fisher folk of Jones Island were essentially sent packing in the 1920s. I think there were some holdouts till, as late as the 1940s. But, originally there were some canals built in the Kinnickinnic as well that eventually were just essentially completely dredged and turned into this, what is the current modern day Port of Milwaukee, the inner harbor there. So, really huge modifications to the Kinnickinnic as well. There's a lot of really fun old stories about, this is one with the Kinnickinnic catching on fire. I mean, clearly the Cuyahoga is one of the most famous rivers to have caught on fire, but we can claim Lincoln Creek, which caught on fire, and the Kinnickinnic as well. This particular one was put out by the boat wake from the boat itself. But, with a lot of that conversion and industry, came a lot of pollution. And, it's also important to mention that, our Clean Water Act didn't come into place until 1972. So this is, full 72 years before that even happened, where, up until the early 70s, you pretty much could discharge anything into a river that you wanted to. There wasn't any federal regulations. There were some state regulations predating the Federal Clean Water Act, but, pretty severe contamination going on with a lot of, these massive changes to the rivers themselves. And a lot of that development and those changes, have started causing problems fairly early on. This left-hand picture of this slide is the Kinnickinnic River in 1912 that was already significantly flooding. So and a lot of this was from a lot of the development. So converting a lot of farm fields, to houses and to streets and to hard surfaces, essentially means that a lot of that water that used to soak in and that was soaked up by a lot of probably prairie plants with very great root systems, a lot of that runoff was just going right into the river during this development, and still, continues to this day. But the Kinnickinnic is one of our most urbanized watersheds today. It's about 90% developed, but early on we were seeing flooding problems there that were pretty significant because it was a pretty small little creek that I think really just couldn't physically take a lot of the flow that was coming in from the development. And that really has continued through current day. This is a picture from the 60s of flooding in some of the neighborhoods adjacent to the Kinnickinnic. And so how we kind of dealt with that was we came in and concretized everything in the 50s and the 60s. And we have concrete channel really throughout the whole city of Milwaukee, but it's very much dominant in the Kinnickinnic River, where it basically can be found in the majority of the stream miles in the main stem of the river system. And also some of the major tributaries, Wilson Park Creek and Villaman Creek and Lions Park Creek, a lot of those creeks were all concretized. And I think the idea back then was, well, let's send all the water as quickly as possible into the stream and it'll wash away from the homes. But then, it just sends that flooding downstream to another neighborhood that then has issues, and then they had to concretize that section. And then it became kind of like a domino effect where we ended up with massive concrete channelization. And certainly in the Menomonee River watershed in the Milwaukee, we also have some concrete channelized creeks, but not as many as we certainly have on the south side in the Kinnickinnic. But, clearly that is a main problem. It really does funnel all of the runoff funnels very efficiently into those concrete channelized sections, which, beyond creating water flooding or water quantity issues, if you will, also causes a lot of water quality issues because, you have a lot of water going very quickly into the river and not really soaking into a lot of places, unfortunately, and rushing into the river causing issues. So, a lot of these changes have, had some major impacts on our waterways. And so some of those are, we can fix. This is just one example of a project that happened on the Kinnickinnic kind of in around 2009-ish. It ended up being around a $22 million project that was largely funded by the federal government with some state and local share. But, a lot of these early contaminants that found their way into the river from industry are still there. And so we're having to go back in now and remove those at very high costs. And so this is just one example on the Kinnickinnic of one of those projects. And then a little bit later on, we'll get into a few more of the restoration projects that have happened along that river. But this just gives you a sense of, the ramifications from a lot of the early development that we're kind of still dealing with. And I'll apologize a bit. I kind of was grappling a bit with how to organize these slides if I wanted to go chronologically by river or so I feel like I might be going back and forth a little bit. So hopefully you can bear with me. But so, the other thing that we did early on, really throughout our watersheds, was create dams. And so this is actually a pretty cool picture of North Avenue Dam on the lower Milwaukee River. And it's pretty interesting. This picture on the left is from 1872 from the Library of Congress, but you really see not only the dam, but essentially this canal that they built, which was meant to power a lot of the industries and the grist mills, factories that kind of line this section of the river early on. And, I think we know this area now as Commerce Street area, where we have kind of what people will call the Condo Canyon. But, we have a lot of this whole area has now developed into residential, but you can see from these old pictures and all those smokestacks and all the manipulations to the river that, that all left a mark, if you will. And, I think there were there was major impacts to removing North Avenue. This actually happened a bit before I ended up moving to the town, but it's been a pretty huge transformation. That dam, the mill race, I guess, was actually the first dam was built in 1835. So and there were several different dams. We think 3 different structures over the years, but the mill race was filled in the 1884 or so, and the North Avenue Dam itself was breached, I think, around mid 90s, but was actually fully removed, I believe, in 97, 98. But it was a huge issue because it really did improve water quality pretty dramatically in downtown Milwaukee. We also went from about 4 species of fish in downtown to about 40-ish species now of fish. It really was a pretty transformative project, if not a bit controversial. But not only was there North Avenue Dam, we have dozens of dams upstream and throughout the watershed. Many of them we've taken out. There's actually been 11 dams taken out by the global we taxpayers throughout the Milwaukee Basin, which is really amazing, actually. And we'll just talk about a couple of those. But there's still a lot behind, a lot of old mill dams that are just still out there. In some cases, there are folks that own dams in this state that don't even realize that they do. These are just kind of some fun, iconic pictures of the impoundment. So this was the area, the lake-like area that was created by North Avenue Dam, which clearly removing that dam kind of took away. But there's some very fun pictures of, this is in Gordon Park, of the old bathing house, and clearly the foundation of that structure is still there for you to see today. But there was a lot of boating and a lot of recreation up there then, and there still is, but in a little bit of a different way. But this part of the river, I think there really was a pretty significant transformation from removing that dam. And one of the ones that we've been very involved with and I think very proud of is we're actually close to, we helped advocate for the Milwaukee River Greenway. So essentially, trying to figure out here, so the North Avenue Dam was kind of down here-ish. And so this area that you see that's all green in the left-hand picture is really an area, most of this area was underwater when the North Avenue Dam was in place. And then when that dam was removed, it essentially created these ribbons of land, exposed these floodplains on either side that, are now available for, for recreational use. They're also a very important kind of buffers or sponges that help us filter a lot of polluted runoff and stuff from our cityscapes. And actually, we helped advocate, and I think it was around 15 years ago now, for passage of the Greenway legislation, which essentially was a zoning overlay district that protected all of these colored areas that you see on the map. But essentially, it's, and I think it's not only created a recreational asset. We have a lot of different partners in the Greenway Coalition, Urban Ecology Center, River Revitalization Foundation, Riverkeeper, and many community groups working to kind of create trails on both sides of the river to, continue to improve the resource and make it more of an asset to the community. But I think it's really amazing that you can go down into this part of the Milwaukee River and really have we call it the urban wilderness, but you really have a nature experience and you're really right in the center of the city. And it's, pretty spectacular. And so we're really proud of that. And part of, in addition to creating a buffer which protects the city from flooding and protects the river from water quality pollutants, we also kind of made sure to pay attention to design and height restrictions so that when you're in the bottom of that river corridor, you really still feel like you're in a wilderness because you don't see too many buildings. You see some kind of popping up here and there. But that was about 8 miles of river that are protected via zoning and about 800 acres. And so a little bit further upstream, we've already started some of the work. Again, the global we, removing a lot of contaminated sediments. Again, this is the Milwaukee River and kind of part of Lincoln Park, and then Estabrook Park's a little further downstream. But a lot of this work started around 2005 or thereabouts and took quite a long time. There were several different phases of cleanup, but that I think all of the projects in Lincoln Park, in Estabrook Park, as far as the removing contaminated sediments, ended up being around $50 million or thereabouts. And, this is Lincoln Creek on the left-hand map coming in, but that's the creek I mentioned earlier that used to catch on fire. But we don't know exactly the source of a lot of the contaminants. We do know that it came from Lincoln Creek. There was a lot of heavy industry and still some industry today along that creek. But, a lot of those contaminants, why they matter is that they are really toxic, they're carcinogenic, and they get into the fish, and they also bioaccumulate, which means that they get into us. So, the more fish you eat, the more of these chemicals you get in your body, and it can cause a lot of really bad health effects. So we already had kind of a big, feather in our hat removing this contamination. Further upstream in Cedarburg, there was some fairly significant cleanups up there as well to remove some historic contamination from Cedarburg, which we don't think about, but was also had a lot of industrial activity back in the day. So with all of those projects, we think we've removed about 70% of the known sources of these industrial chemicals from the lower Milwaukee River. That said, there's still definitely some sediment downstream that we'll still have to remove in the next probably 5 years, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But once a lot of those sediments were removed, we were able to consider removing the Estabrook Dam, which was downstream of that section. And folks might have heard about this removal. It happened about 2 years ago or so in 2018. I'm trying to remember what year I'm in. Last year just seems like it was kind of a weird year, right? Like kind of, the COVID year. But 2018, I think, is when we actually removed it. But this is the pre-picture, if you will, and this is a cool picture. It was built by the CCC, who had camps in Estabrook Park and Lincoln Park, and did work pretty much in all of the Milwaukee County parks. A lot of the really high quality masonry that you see and railings and steps and everything that's kind of falling apart and needs replaced now, is a lot of it was done by the CCC. But they actually had done some pretty significant river manipulations upstream of here to accommodate more development. They removed a bunch of S-curves and made the river straight, so that people could develop more adjacent to it. But that just kind of exacerbated the flooding. And so there was a bunch of limestone that was dynamited out so that the river would move faster and more efficiently. But then eventually they were successful in dropping the river levels, which is what everybody wanted. And then folks started, I guess, feeling like, oh, well, it was kind of nice when we had higher water because we could boat and do things. So then they decided to create the Estabrook Dam and really to raise water levels again and to be able to manipulate the water levels. So generally the dam was open from fall to spring, but would be closed in the summer months to create an impoundment or a pond for recreation. But a lot of these old structures, Estabrook Dam was well over around 100 years old when it was taken out. And had fallen into disrepair and was deemed a public nuisance. And we had 4 or 5-ish lawsuits against different folks trying to get this dam out. But eventually it was removed in 2018, and this is kind of the after picture, if you will. But again, a lot of these projects, I think were done for different reasons. Each dam has its own kind of story, if you will, but there are a lot of, defunct structures out there that, are going to cost, in some cases, maybe 5 to 10 times more to maintain them than to remove them. So, and removing them is really good for the river. It helps water quality. It helps with fish passage and allows fish to reach spawning areas upstream. Let me check my time really quick. So, similarly, there's been a lot of other big restoration projects in different creeks in the system. This is the Menomonee River. This is kind of near the upper left picture is Miller Park. So that, again, was a project that was taken on by MMSD, and we partnered on some monitoring and cleanups and other associated elements. And then the bottom picture is removing some of the concrete on Underwood Creek, and then also meandering the river, so making it seem like a river again. And slowing down a river generally helps it go into floodplains and facilitates its infiltration, which is really good for flooding and helps minimize flooding downstream. And also helps improve water quality and kind of, we can't always put a river back the way it was, especially with the way that we've built the cities, but we often try to do what we can, where we can, to provide some pools, to provide some riffle areas, some fast areas, some different habitat types that are really important for fish and aquatic life. Because ultimately, I think the goal is that everyone should be able to go to the creek outside their house and throw a line in and grab a fish, and so hopefully we'll get to the point one day when that's, we'll have created the infrastructure where that could happen. And this is an after picture of Underwood Creek, which is one of the more recent concrete projects that MMSD has taken on. And so these are some other stream restoration projects that Riverkeeper was really involved in. A lot of times we'll go in and try to restore degraded stream banks and stabilize them. This was a small dam that was removed in Mequon on Pigeon Creek that opened up 600 acres of spawning habitat for fish. And this is kind of the after picture. The dam was back here. But, we try to partner with municipalities. A lot of times, well, I think it won't surprise many people that rivers are often not high on the list of many cities, not because they don't love them, but because, they have a lot of other conflicting priorities and funding needs. So often we'll come in and try to raise grants and raise money to do some of these projects. This is an example of some lower kind of fish passage structures on the lower Menomonee River that were removed also to facilitate fish moving up. I think, when people think of fish, they think about salmon and that salmon can jump over these big structures. And, clearly salmon was introduced into Lake Michigan to deal with some invasive species like the alewife. But a lot of our native fish, the fish that are native to our rivers, are actually can't jump very well. And many of them don't swim very well, which I know sounds funny to say about a fish, but a lot of northern pike can't swim in anything faster than like 1.4 feet per second. So something like this, that bottom left-hand picture to a pike looks like the Grand Canyon. They don't know what to do with that. And a lot of times what happens is sometimes these are actual pipes in there. They might be a sanitary pipe or a water pipe. They're often put into these concrete boxes and the river will kind of work on it over decades. And eventually, if there's not bedrock, it'll just keep eating away at that structure until it creates something like this. So often, we've come in recent years. This was probably around 8 years ago or so. We came in and removed 5 structures in the Hoyt Park in Tosa. These are just some more pictures of the Kinnickinnic and all of the dramatic transformations that are being looked at there. And there's a plan to essentially take all of the concrete out from 6th Street all the way to 43rd Street, which is Jackson Park. And there's been a lot of work with the community to envision what that could look like, what community amenities could be put in, with really great groups like 16th Street Community Health Center that are doing a lot of the heavy lifting on that project. But we're really trying to get the residents involved as much as possible in these projects. There's 80 some houses that are bought to facilitate this concrete removal. And so those folks are going to have to, or basically, I think most of those acquisitions are done at this point. They will be moved so that they can actually come in here and take this concrete out and make it safe. It's caused a lot of significant flooding. We've unfortunately had several kids die in this section. You do not want to fall into this river when it's flooding. It's very dangerous and really nowhere to grab, no trees or anything. It's very slippery. So very excited about this project. We have hints of what it will look like. There was a very small section that was taken out about 10 years or so ago downstream of 6th Street. The MMSD came in and took out quite a lot of concrete there. And this is kind of what it looks like, what it looked like in 2019. But so these are kind of the projects that are being planned for the whole river system. And we've been really involved in advocating for them and trying to get community feedback on a lot of these projects. This is just another sliver of a project that's happened in Pulaski Park, which is around 16th Street or thereabouts. But again, before picture and some after pictures. This is a pretty recent section. And then a drone shot from last summer. So, the goal really is to make these rivers look like rivers again. We can't make them exactly the way that they used to. And we really couldn't do it without probably flooding adjacent homes. But the idea is to try to restore some functionality, some safety, make them really an asset to the community rather than an eyesore. So we've kind of talked a lot about the physical section of the river, taking the concrete out, making rivers look like rivers again. And that's one really big piece of the puzzle. The other really big piece of the puzzle is, you could have a beautiful looking river, but if you have very poor water quality, you're not going to be able to swim in it. You're not going to be able to fish in it. And you might not want to have your kid wading in it or your dog, your dog even wading in it. We get those questions a lot. But so one of the things that we do too is we test the water so that we can identify sources of pollution, know where we need to do management practices, know where we need better policies. And then also so that we can, over time, hopefully show that this work that we're doing that in some cases is very expensive, is going to pay dividends, not only on the water quality side, but hopefully on the fishery side and the community side, community wellness side. So every year we do a report card. These are all available on our website, going back to 2010. And we get data from, we have quite a few volunteers, but we also get data from MMSD, who monitors a lot, especially in their service area, which is about the southern half of the Milwaukee Basin. And then some DNR data, Ozaukee County data, sewer pack, and some. Black is a MMSD consultant that's helped out with some data in the last few years. But our program at Riverkeeper, in 2019, we had around 75 volunteers that tested 88 sites. I think in 2020, we just started getting all that data back and analyzed, so we'll hopefully have that report card out soonish. But we have a lot of folks that are great people that we train, and they go out there and they test regularly. And so sadly, the grade of our basin is not good. A lot of this is due to all of the stuff I was just talking about. So a lot of the modifications that we've made over the years, converting all of these wild spaces into our city, into hard surfaces, has caused a lot of water quality problems. And again, we're not, this is very common, obviously, throughout the world. But, our watershed it's got a lot of challenges, but also there's a lot of room to be optimistic about its future. I'll say, we have about 875 square miles. This is the entire drainage area of the Milwaukee. So every raindrop that falls on this area ends up into Lake Michigan, under the Home Bridge, basically. But it is a big area, and there's dozens of municipalities to work with, many different people that are landowners, and a lot of challenges. But the Milwaukee Basin, which is this yellow one, is still about 80% rural. And this is the Menomonee in orange, and then the Kinnickinnic that we were just talking about in red. So this is clearly not a grade that you'd want to bring home to mom, but it does oscillate year to year. We normally are at around a C, I would say a C minus. I think one of the major reasons we had such a bad grade in 2019 was that it was actually a record-breaking rainfall year. It was, in fact, the wettest year in history, and it just beat 2018, which was the wettest year prior to that. And so a lot of us think, this really shows the impacts of climate change. We're seeing more wet weather events, more rainfall, more volatility in rain coming all at once, for example. And a lot of that is really bad news for the rivers, which means that, a lot of the things we've been doing, removing concrete, removing dams, providing better buffer systems, these things should all help us with climate change, because we're trying to connect the rivers back to these floodplains or these natural lands adjacent to them. All those areas can act as big sponges for us. We want to make sure that we're protecting the city and everything that's downtown. And we can do that through a lot of the restoration work that we're also doing to protect the river. About 403 of our 875 miles are impaired. And what that means is that they're not meeting one standard for water quality that's deemed important for health. And our biggest issues are sediment, really dirt. The scientific way to say that is total suspended solids, but it's basically dirt that's coming in from ag, coming in from stream bank erosion, from a lot of this runoff that comes in very quickly. And then we have a lot of bacteria problems, which is a lot of failing sewers, failing septic, and runoff from manure from farms, and phosphorus, which is a big fertilizer as well. So those are the areas where we're still kind of not meeting the grade. This is a map of, you can find in our report card if you want to really geek out, but it's all, the different symbol shapes are who monitors, and then the colors are the quality. So the reds are bad, the greens are good. And you can see that even though overall the watershed grade is not great, these are the kind of basic parameters that fish really need to live, and they're all doing pretty well. We have A's for temperature and oxygen. Again, where we're having issues is that bacteria, the phosphorus, and some of the dirt. But a lot of these green arrows are telling me too, we're generally going in the right direction. So I think there's definitely kind of some room for hope. Similarly, this is just the Milwaukee watershed, very similar to the last slide I just showed. And our Menomonee watershed, which is also has about not a lackluster grade. This did have a better grade in 2018, but the rainfall really had a big impact. And then our Kinnickinnic also, which is not doing very well. So we have a lot of work left to do. I don't think we put this out to be like a bummer every year, although sadly it is. And I think it is hard because, when you look at some of those old historical pictures I showed before, this is a 1-year snapshot based on how are we doing meeting the regulations. We're not doing so good. But if you really look at the long-term trajectory, from the 1900s, from the 1850s, to the present day, we've done a lot to these rivers, and it's going to take a long time for us to get from a D+ to an A, or even a B-, which, we're hoping to get to. But, there's a lot of work that we need to do still to improve water quality. So, and there's a lot of room for optimism. And one of the last things I wanted to talk about before we go into Q&A is I think some people have probably been hearing a little bit in the news potentially about our area of concern. And there's a lot of excitement around getting some really serious money into town to deal with a lot of this legacy contamination. And so what that means is it's essentially a designation that by EPA, and it was basically a program that was started in the 80s, so around 1987, which was the same time as a pretty significant update in the Clean Water Act. But they basically then, they identified areas in the Great Lakes that were of concern, meaning they had significant environmental degradation, often from legacy pollution. And so there wasn't a polluter to sue. There wasn't somebody you could go after for funding because a lot of these companies are long gone. And the stuff is just still lurking underneath the water level. So, these are areas that need some extra attention in order for the public to fully for the public to fully use them to their potential. So for fishing, swimming, drinking. So there were 43, I believe, that were designated in the US and Canada, and you can see Milwaukee on there. And so these are all the other areas that were part of the area of concern program. Some of them have been delisted. Those are the stars, meaning they've been cleaned up to the point where, the EPA is pretty happy with that most of this legacy pollution is gone. And actually Waukegan, which is just to our south, is pretty close to being done. But we still have a ways to go. So our area of concern was originally defined is really just that deep estuary, which is this deeper section of our rivers that are near the confluence with Lake Michigan, and where there's a lot of interaction back and forth between the lake and the rivers. And then about 10-ish years ago, we extended the AOC to include up to some pretty significant Superfund sites, so sites that were contaminated. The Cedarburg site was Mercury Marine, which had a very significant contamination of Cedar Creek, which then has gone down quite a ways into the river. And on the Menomonee River, there was a company called Moss American, which is now, it's changed to Kerr-McGee, and then it's now owned by Tronox. But essentially it was a company a long time ago that used to put creosote on railroad ties that contaminated a very significant section of the Menomonee River. So by extending the AOC to those areas, we were able to bring more money into town to clean up those river sections. And some of those cleanups have already happened. I showed some slides of those earlier. So that's good news. So I just mentioned this, it was designated because of a lot of this historical contamination. So the EPA comes up with this list that they call beneficial use impairments, and it's not important that you remember any of that. But essentially, these are kind of the goals of what they want the program to do. It's really trying to clean up the rivers and lake, and again, trying to restore some of that natural function and habitat so that people can actually use the rivers the way that they should, and also use the lakefront. So it's trying to reduce the days that the beaches are closed, trying to make sure that if you do go out and fish, you can safely eat that fish. It's not going to be a health issue. Trying to make sure that, that fish don't have deformities from a lot of these toxins in the bottom of the river. We have, sadly, a lot of deformities of some of our fish because they are in contact with these contaminants that are in the bottom of the river. And they're at a much higher percentage, about double the percentage that we would like to see, based on areas similarly, like Racine, for example, that didn't have the same level of historic contamination, but that's still in a city. So there's a lot of work that's being done to clean up the sediments that are toxic and to also, improve habitats and then improve places for humans too, improve the beaches, make sure that improving the aesthetics, improving algae that can be unsightly. And so how we really fix it is we need to do a lot of cleanup work. So we're creating habitat, we're removing invasive species, planting a lot of trees, reducing pollution. But, all of that is very expensive. I mentioned earlier, I think that we had a dredging project in the Kinnickinnic. And so that's the completed section that's kind of in the green. Let's see here, am I getting this wrong here? Yeah, no. So this is a little bit of an older map, but we've done some cleanup here. We've done some big cleanup here in the Milwaukee River in Lincoln Park, which I showed some pictures of. So there's still this whole section of the Milwaukee River, which is downstream of where we took the Estabrook Dam out, that historically does have contamination because the dam was opened and closed all the time. So even though all of the contamination has been cleaned out up here, a lot of it got down the main stem of the Milwaukee. So similarly on the Menomonee, a lot of the Menomonee's been tested. This Superfund site's been mostly cleaned up. And so basically downstream from City Lights Brewing, which is around 25th Street or thereabouts, there was an old coal gasification plant there from We Energies. That whole section is going to have to be dredged. There was also another We Energies coal plant in the 3rd Ward, which was basically had some significant contamination to the downtown section of the Milwaukee River. And then they also had a site at what we call Solvay Coke, which is right next to the School of Freshwater Sciences and the new Komatsu site in the port, this kind of purple area on the bottom of this map. That also was another coal gasification site. So a lot of this is going to be, we need to come in and clean up a lot of contaminants from the bottom of the river. We Energies is paying for some of that. The bulk of it will be paid for by taxpayers, through this special area of concern program. And they pay around 65%, and then the state has to pay the remaining 35%. So that is one of the big projects that's going to happen. We're hoping all of this work will be started and end in the next 5 years, is what we're being told by EPA, although, all of this is contingent on funding. We don't know exactly what the price tag is going to be, but it could be hundreds of millions of dollars, between $100 and $200 million to clean this up. But that when we remove those sediments, we can address multiple impairments at the same time, deal with any fish tumors, deformities of wildlife, degradation of benthos means like the kind of critters, the really small bits of the food chain that are badly affected from the contamination. All of that stuff can be only addressed by removing these contaminants. But I should say there's also going to be quite a lot of habitat projects. We've identified, I think it's close to 20 habitat projects in this whole map area where we'd be able to make some pretty significant changes to address fish and wildlife issues. And there's also projects that are currently still being identified to deal with a lot of the AOC beaches. So that's McKinley, Bradford, South Shore Beach, which is looking to be moved, and also what we call Bayview Beach, which is just south of South Shore Beach. So a lot of that work is going to be funded. The habitat projects can be funded 100% by the EPA. These dredging projects, it's like a cost share situation. But there's been studies throughout all of these areas of concern that for every $2 to $3 spent, for every dollar spent, we're getting about $2 to $3 of extra bang for our buck. And obviously huge benefits to tourism, to property values, and to decrease costs to cities and counties that would have to do a lot of this work. And so, we're really pushing EPA to make us a priority. We're still technically in competition with all of those other dots that you saw on that bigger Great Lakes map for the same pot of money. But we're basically been working really hard since the late 80s to get all of our ducks in a row. And I think we're finally at the point where we have everything identified, most of the sampling done. There's some still design and engineering work happening this year, but we could be seeing, hopefully, knock on wood, money coming in, soonish to really start this work up. Potentially even starting next year, or some habitat projects starting as well. So lastly, it's a really big deal for the rivers. It will deal with a lot of this legacy contamination that happened, well before we had the Clean Water Act, as I mentioned. A lot of those early pictures that we saw, it's really a really huge effort of the city and the county and the Port of Milwaukee, a lot of nonprofit groups, community groups, polluters, a lot of different people coming together. MMSD is coming together and helping a tremendous amount. So a lot of people coming together to make sure that this happens and it happens quickly. And the goal is, EPA really has a goal to finish most of this work by 2024, which is very aggressive, but we're hoping to get about a 5-year period when we can get a lot of the work done. So what that will mean is that there will be a lot of construction, potentially a lot of public meetings, trying to figure out when the work can be done. So it's as, not as least disruptive as possible to especially people living along the rivers downtown, working along the rivers. But it will be really transformational for the river. So we're really excited about that. And the ripple effects too, that I think it will have on improving water quality and improving a lot of the conditions that we need for wildlife. So, that is really the goal, is to get to a point where that river is healthy for recreation and can be used for things like fishing and swimming. And we don't have to worry about people's health, who are out there using and enjoying the rivers. Lastly, there is a community advisory committee. It's kind of in the process of being rehashed, just because we foresee the work in the next 5 years is going to be very significant. So we have a local funder, Fund for Lake Michigan, who stepped up to actually help pay some people to be part of that committee because of the time that will be involved in vetting a lot of these projects and making sure that there's the appropriate community feedback. So, but that is something that we'll be having regular community meetings to keep people informed of the work. And so you can follow that work on MilwaukeeEstuaryAOC.com, which I know is kind of wonky. You can also follow us at MilwaukeeRiverkeeper.org, and we will definitely keep you up to date on all of those big projects that we see. But also, projects like our water quality monitoring. We have river cleanup, which is coming up on April 24th. We're actually going to do an in-person river cleanup this year. We generally get around 4,000 volunteers at 65-ish sites. And so we are going to have staggered registration times and smaller sites more widely distributed to deal with COVID, but hoping that we'll still be able to get people out there and do a good spring cleanup of the rivers this year. So you can follow us at MilwaukeeRiverkeeper.org for more information on that. And also we're on Facebook and Instagram and all of those places to if you want to follow us there, to just learn more about events and ways that you can get involved. So I think with that, I've gone over my time, but
You're good.
Would love to take some questions.
Absolutely. I'll get your PowerPoint out of there. It's so interesting to see the transformation over time of all of these, the rivers and the basin and all that. Is there, like, I will say first, people put your questions in, please. But we got a lot of great questions. I'm just going to start as we populate some more, as far as like you as the Riverkeeper. Is there something that makes, like, what's a good day at work look like for you? Like, what's something that's like, oh, this is great. Like, what gets you?
Well, my favorite, I'm a biologist, which I probably should have started with, which is why, like, my history was, I was telling John earlier, was like a little bit like a fish out of water for me. I love history. I'm a history geek, but I'm a biologist. So I would say my favorite days on the river are when I get to go out with citizens and test water. I am very geeked out when we get to go and partner with DNR or one of our counties to do fish monitoring, which is super fun. We've gotten very into freshwater mussels. We are generally trying to do at least 1 or 2 trainings a year on freshwater mussels, but they're really amazing. They're highly endangered worldwide, but we have some pretty amazing mussel populations in the Milwaukee River. So if you're ever out playing in the river and looking down and you have clear water, you can see them often on the bottom of the river breathing and bubbling up. And they're just like super fascinating. I could go through the whole like reproductive cycle of mussels. It's really crazy stuff. And they need fish hosts to survive and to propagate. And so those dams, for example, are very bad for mussels because they stop the fish hosts often from moving around and moving mussels from one place to another. But anyway, those are my favorite days. We have a patrol boat, which I don't know if I mentioned earlier. That's the days I get to be on the boat too, taking people out or doing some monitoring from the boat. Those are also really great, fun days for us. But we do monitor water. We test what's coming out of some of the stormwater pipes. So we get to be out on the water a lot. So those are my fun days. I do a lot of meetings, and those are the less fun days, but also very important.
Boy, I just, with the thaw going on, being on a boat sounds just delightful right now.
Yeah, right.
So Leroy was asking, so you were talking about I think it was Lincoln Creek. Is that the one that caught fire? So
Yep.
that generated some buzz on the comment stream here, as far as that's not something that's talked about a lot, as far as Milwaukee history goes. So is there anywhere we can find more info on that? How common was that? Did it happen a lot?
It was pretty common. So Lincoln Creek apparently caught on fire a couple different times. And I think like going into like the 50s, 60s times, like at one point, one of the stories I heard, and I'm trying to remember the story, but I think there was actually something that had caught on fire, like a business. It was like a petroleum fire, and a lot of it washed into the river. And then I think somebody was like burning leaves or something. And the river basically caught fire because there had been all of this discharge. So I think the big, you might be able to Google it, but the Lincoln Creek fire, I want to say it was sometime in the 50s and the 60s, but it was pretty common, and there was a lot of heavy industry at one point. The 30th Street corridor, which is a big area of concern in Milwaukee that we're working to kind of redevelop, similar to the Menomonee Valley. It had a ton of industry and still does have quite a lot of industry. Although, we'd like to see more in that section because people really need jobs in that section of Milwaukee. But that whole area also drains to Lincoln Creek. So, there was a lot of historical contamination in that river. And my understanding was that it caught fire quite a bit. And then the other story that was the interesting one was in 1900, I just found this out recently for another presentation, but the Kinnickinnic caught on fire, and a boat saw that it was on fire, and then kind of like in the way that in its wake, from kind of going up the river, it basically put the fire out just from the wake of the boat. But I think, back then it was, like I said, before the Clean Water Act in the 70s, you basically could discharge anything to a river. So a lot of, companies discharged oil, grease, petroleum, and frankly, a lot of that is the stuff that we're going to be dredging out. We call it PAHs, which is polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, but what it means is it's oil, grease, petroleum, creosote, all of that gunk that's used a lot in industry to insulate machines to make things, make it so that things, can kind of move, and all of that stuff is very, very toxic and carcinogenic, not only to us, but to fish and other critters in the bottom of the river. So that is a lot of what's being removed, and it is also what catches fire. So unfortunately, that is a big part of what we're taking out, and also PCBs, which were like an insulator too. And PCBs were used in like carbon paper, and so many crazy things. But it's we really, these things have been in the river since before I was born in some cases, and so we're now going to have to go out and clean it up.
Yeah, the economy has transformed so much, and hopefully this will build a better version.
Yeah.
Kirsten wants to know, this is a fun question, are there any restoration plans in the works to reintroduce beaver populations to the less developed upper watershed?
That is a great question. We actually have a beaver project right now, which we haven't really released a lot of information about, but interestingly, beaver are, there's a lot, they're very controversial, obviously. They are increasingly very common in the lower part of the watershed. They've done a pretty good job in the third ward, taking some trees down. Along the Milwaukee River, the lower Milwaukee, they're very busy. Even along like the Hank State Trail, they've been taking out trees between the seawall and the Hank State Trail. I don't even know how they get up from the water to those areas in some cases. They're pretty amazing. But we have a lot of wandering beavers. We do have a couple that are creating lodges up on Trinity Creek in Mequon, and in Lincoln Park, there's some pretty active beaver populations on that part of the Milwaukee River. I would say the northern part of the Milwaukee Basin, we don't have as many beaver. And so we were doing, we had some work with a professor at UW Milwaukee to basically model what the impact would be of bringing in some beavers ponds and some more beavers to the watershed, and whether we could address flooding. And it's pretty fascinating, actually, like based on, all the different scenarios of how many we could put into different places and how much storage those ponds could, create during these wet weather events. We think that they could be a really significant tool to actually helping with flood management because they hold on to water and slowly release it. Interestingly, a lot of fish can get through beaver ponds too, the beaver dams, because they're not always like completely impermeable. They do generally drain over time, and so it's pretty cool project. I think are really important. They're ecosystem creators. They create ponds that are so important for so many other different types of wildlife out there. So, one of the things that we are hoping to do is just educate people more about the importance of beavers. They don't really have any protections in Wisconsin. I mean, you really, I don't even like to talk about it, but I mean, you really can do anything to a beaver. No one cares here. You don't need a permit. If it's causing a nuisance, you can trap it, you can move it. But we would really like to see people have a little bit more reverence for the beaver. We have introduced beavers a couple years ago. We had one that was hit by a car and recuperated. And we released it at the Schlitz Audubon Nature Center, which is off of Brown Deer Road. His name was Chip. We had Chip for a while. And until we felt that otters were eating his food because there was mussel shells and stuff going into the box where we left the food, and beavers are vegetarians. So we hope Chip's out there and doing well, but we're hoping to get to a point where we might be able to reintroduce beavers into some selected areas. MMSD owns a lot of property that they bought specifically for flood management. So we're really hoping to maybe try to create a pond or even put some boards in to encourage dam creation in certain areas on their properties potentially to try to see if we could do some modeling around how much water retention we could get. So it's actually a lot of kind of cool science and stuff happening right now around beavers and whether they could be helpful engineers for us, if you will, with a lot of our flooding problems. So stay tuned on that. But yes, we love beavers.
We'll have you back for an updated beaver focused talk.
Yes, we can totally talk about beavers.
I think one more question just to wrap up here as we're surpassing the 1 hour mark is, a lot of these problems were created by giant factories and a lot of pollution and things like that. So, and you've talked about the cleaning up being this major project. Is there anything like that I can do as just private citizen me? What can I do, this summer or this year to help assist in this effort?
That's a great question. So I have a whole other presentations on that too. But I think, this time of year, who knows if we're getting more snow. I think sadly we will probably. But road salt's a huge issue. We have 120 miles of river that are impaired for road salt. And road salt, that means we have areas in our rivers that are so salty that we think they can be instantly toxic or even lethal to fish. And a lot of that's coming from road runoff, especially highway runoff into some creeks, smaller creeks in particular, that tend to get more concentrated salt and have more issues like Uleo Creek and Underwood Creek and Honey Creek. But we have a lot of problems, 100 miles-ish, 120 miles of problems. But, people can do a lot by shoveling early and often, really minimizing road salt. We tell people, a coffee mug should be enough salt for a whole driveway or for 10 sidewalk squares. So you can do a lot by really minimizing that. In the summer, similarly, you don't really need to use very much fertilizer or pesticide. Certainly, if you are going to use something like that, make sure that you're not putting it on before a rain event where it's going to wash all of your money down the drain and into the river. We tell people, fertilizer does to the river what it does to your lawn, it turns them green. So when you start seeing a lot of plants and algae on rivers, a lot of that is from fertilizers, from us, from farmers. And so all of those things are really important. Bringing toxic chemicals to the city drop-off sites and, not dumping them. That seems obvious, but you wouldn't believe the stories I have on that. And also this amazing new effort, it's called Take Back My Meds Milwaukee. And so you can Google it. It's like Take Back My Meds, MKE, I believe. But it's basically all of these collection drop boxes where you can take old drugs. A lot of people used to flush those. That's a whole other conversation as well. I could do a whole PowerPoint on that. But a lot of these drugs are getting through us and into the sewage treatment system and going right out into the lake, really not treated. And they can cause a lot of crazy issues to fish and aquatic life. We call those emerging pollutants, but a lot of people were taught over the years to flush them, to get them out of the house. And unfortunately, a lot of that is just getting eventually to our waters, either through broken pipes or through the sewage treatment system itself. So we're really encouraging people to drop off all those drugs at those collection boxes instead. And utilizing all of the, the special events for dropping off medicines and stuff would be really helpful.
Yeah, it's as you can see in the exhibit at the Historical Society, which is going on right now, Milwaukee, where the water's made, is, we're here because of the water, and we will continue to be here because of the water, right? So we want to make sure we protect that valuable resource. Cheryl, thank you so much. This was a fascinating presentation. I could ask you questions for like another hour, but we had a beer release today. I don't know if you caught that at the beginning.
You did.
And I am.
Let's go have some beer.
I'm wanting to get back to that. No, but so thank you so much for your presentation. That was just phenomenal. There is a whole take action part of our exhibit too, that has a bunch of literature related to what you're talking about. So hopefully people can see that too. So MilwaukeeHistory.net, you can find that. And then you said it was at MilwaukeeRiverkeeper.org. Is that where you can find more info? Are all your fancy maps and charts on there too? Because those are, people really like the maps and charts.
They're not, but I definitely can figure out a way to get them to you, or we could send you the or PDF or something. It's
fascinating to kind of see your place in the world through a map like that, and like, where we rate on the charts and stuff like that. So that's interesting. Next week, so kind of related to what I was talking about with the beer, we're going to go more historically focused next week. The tragedy of the Lady Elgin will be next week with Carl Baer. So 7:30 next Thursday, March 4th. If you're watching tonight, you'll be able to see it then. If you figured it out already, you're a smart person. But Cheryl, thanks so much. And it sounds like we could have you back for another one at some point.
I'd love to.
There's a lot of interest in all this stuff. So thank you to Cheryl, and thank you all for tuning in and watching, and we hope to see you again. Have a good night.
Thank you.